welcome back to those who have joined us before, and welcome to those who are new. We run this event on the last Wednesday of every month, the same time, and we will cover themes related to health, illness, medicine, disability, care, all of these topics. And every time we try to pick a different theme. So today's theme is on self-harm, and we're joined by Sarah Redikopp and Rob Colgate. So I hope you all saw in the event posting, but I'm just going to reiterate trigger warnings for self-harm, suicidality, trauma, psychiatric, I'm losing the word, psychiatric violence. And I really invite people to engage in whatever way is best for you. So if that means cameras off, totally go for it. If you need to just leave the Zoom at some point, fine, no problem. If you want to rejoin, also great. So please just be comfortable. And I will also start off on the topic of where everyone is from. I am usually based in Toronto, and that's also where the league is technically based, although we're obviously all coming from all over. So in Toronto, we are working on land that is originally called Tikaronto, and in Mohawk, that means where there are trees standing in the water. Today, it's covered by Treaty number 13 in the Williams Treaty, as well as the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant. And today, Toronto is home to a huge variety of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, but originally we are on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. I've been really lucky while in Mexico to get to meet and learn from people about the Indigenous people of Mexico and how colonization has had impacts here and continues to have impacts here. So hopefully we can all continue to do that wherever we are. And now for introducing our wonderful duo today. So from the poetry side, we have Rob Colgate, who is, of course, not just a poet, also a playwright, also has an academic doing their postdoc in University of Alberta, right? Yes. And also a poet in residence at Tangled, which is this amazing kind of art and disability gallery space group in Toronto. So if you're ever in Toronto, would definitely recommend checking them out. Rob's work has been published widely. They're originally from Evanston, Illinois, which again, with my American geography, I don't actually know where that is, but we're so happy to have you. And Edmonton is very lucky to have you as well as a postdoc. And then Sarah Redikopp is a mad researcher and writer who's currently about to soon defend her PhD in the Gender Studies Department at York University. Her really brilliant graduate work has explored madness and critical disability perspectives on self-harm and trying to trouble how psychiatry looks at self-harm as a psychiatric problem and to kind of articulate where we can go from there. And so Sarah's going to be sharing her research and perspectives on the topic of self-harm. So on that note, Sarah's also, I would say, very widely published and has brilliant work that you can read in journals online as well. So we're really lucky to have both of you. And did we decide which of you is going first? I can't remember, no? I'm going to just we're going to start with the poetry. Rob, if you could take the lead. And I'm going to stop sharing this.
Thank you, Mariam and League of Canadian Poets for inviting me to this. I'm going to start with a poem. Airport Boulevard, December. My doctor said I was lucky. Actually, she said, this will last forever, and it is up to you to decide how long that is. So I always like to start with a poem. I trust them way more than I do myself. I think they say better things than me. But I'm Rob. I use he, she, and they pronouns, a visual description. I am a Filipino boyish type looking person with short pink and black hair. I'm wearing a white shirt, sort of cut off at the shoulder. I'm sitting in my kitchen and I have a big smile on my face because I love poetry and I'm really grateful to have this space. A lot of self-harm poems. I don't usually get to read at readings because they can be triggering. So I'm excited to have this space. Just a little preface to my work, and then I'm going to try to read for no more than 20 minutes, and I might cut myself off if it feels like it's, I can't, it's a lot to listen to poetry at all. So I've really been thinking about the poem as a body. We talk about body paragraphs, the body of the text, the body of the essay. And so when I think about the poem as a body, and as the poem as an extension of the poet's body, I've been thinking about what it means to harm the poem, especially when the poem is the self, in form and content. What does it mean to take the body of the poem and do something to it with the intent of injury or breaking? And where does that intent come from? And what forces are driving that intent that maybe are not as obvious as we think? So that's a bit of what I'm thinking about. I'm also thinking about self-harm in a disability lens, and disability through a social model instead of a medical model, thinking about disabling forces, particularly those of capitalism and colonialism, self-harm as a natural response to unnatural conditions. And so in thinking about self-harm as a result of larger disabling forces, and thinking about how all struggles are interconnected, and how we can't talk about self-harm in the West as a result of colonialism without talking about genocide happening in the Middle East and Palestine right now, as a result of those very same insidious forces. So I wanted to make sure that even as we're talking about this, recognizing that we are not disconnected from what is happening right now in Palestine, and that if we are to do the work of not redeeming, but finding place for self-harm in a colonial world, that very work is tied into freeing Palestine, and ending the genocide and calling for a ceasefire now. So that is sort of frameworking my work. I'm going to read some poems now. Trigger warning, self-harm. Cool. Therapist. She is not very good at her job. Psychosis under control. We do not get into childhood. The hiding in an empty dehumidifier box, or going from friend's house to friend's house, telling each I had eaten at the last. Instead, she wants to be my friend, and I think she could be a good friend if she were not supposed to be helping me, if she were not some flimsy proxy for a doctor. But she is. She runs the insurance every week, and I cannot tell what she knows and remembers about me, whether she is trying to find something bad about me or has simply run out of meaningful questions. I tell her that sometimes when the run doesn't stretch me enough, I look up the cost of certain cosmetic procedures. She does not ask how I might find a more innocent way to convene with my stomach fat. Instead, she asks how much the procedures cost, considers getting one herself. No, Angie, shouldn't we just learn to love our bodies? When I tell her I am trying to get to know my madness as a friend, she insists that I must start asking Eli to ensure I take my medication every night. And sometimes, at home, I hear her voice like I have left my earbuds on my desk while going to the kitchen and the music is still playing. The voice says, "You have such a handle on things, it's like you're not even actually mentally ill." And I wish it were a hallucination instead of a memory. When I want to kill myself, I figure out an approximation of the feeling to share with her so I am not reinstitutionalized. I think I would rather be a sunbeam than have to exist in this hard and formal body. She gives advice as if out of a greeting card. Just because you are in a storm doesn't mean it's over. And I know by it she means my life, but what I hear is the storm. One day I ask her what she really thinks will happen when my coverage ends and I must go on living like this. She says, "To be honest, I think you will probably die from this." To her meaning the sickness, to me meaning my life. Ward. Window. What allows you to see out, what separates you from what you see, your only chance. Ward. To keep away, to safeguard, guarded place you are kept. Touched, honored, possessed, violated. See someone, a lover, a therapist, a hallucination. Murder, crows, a dying. Institution, me and all my friends, a dying. Form, a body, a set of rules, a set of empty spaces to fill out at the front desk. Derange, to go crazy, to finally leave a restricted range. Commitment, you're staying, you're staying. Chronic, lasting forever, not dead yet. Cavity, an emptiness, a failure to care for yourself like a child. No toothbrush. A case for self-harm, which I cannot write, though I do want to. It does feel good to break. It does feel better to be broken, for one's outsides to match their insides. The urge to hurt oneself never truly going away, instead just metabolizing into the body, subsumed into instinct. Therein lies a taut worry that presses from beneath my skin, a deep-set understanding that twitches like a muscle, a mumbled fear that I pick at like a scab, that the tendency to respond to stimuli like this was inborn. As in, the dog gnaws off its injured leg, the bee delivers its singular sting, the porcupine never stops pricking itself, just stays slicked with fatty antibiotic. The owl swallows bone and feather in order to eat, reliant on its own vomiting, while the panda simply cannot digest its bamboo. And the blue whale beaches itself when it knows its time has come, and now we take off to the museum, stare up at its suspended and incomplete skeleton, and maybe this moment of awe, this afternoon in which you have dragged me out of bed, will be the argument against those behavioral patterns of harm that we hush. We do not owe health and safety to the world, but we do, or at least I do, to you, Eli, and I'm sorry, there is no conclusion here, and I see my wounded friends, or I don't, but I love them, and I do, and all these rhythms soon will change, the split arm no longer splitting towards the truth, the blood quieter than we remember, the grown salmon swimming back into fresh water to spawn. Sestina medicated on 800 milligrams of antipsychotics. I worry I am faking. I am doing it for attention. I want to avoid consequences, so I make people feel bad for me. Nothing is a reasonable trigger. I have far too much insight. It always feels like faking. I pay too much attention to a boy and create consequences for my own eagerness. Bad me. My own mistake is the trigger, and I already have this insight as the episode starts. Faker. I pay too much attention during the episode, and the consequence is self-awareness, while the bad me goes off about being triggered. It is having this conscious insight that makes me think I am faking. I feel like splitting my attention shouldn't be possible. Consequently, while I am watching the bad me, the good me feels triggered to expose him, in spite of both being me. Sounds fake. I should just choose to stop intentionally. I should just deal with consequences. I invalidate real schizos. So bad of me to do. When an episode is triggered, it should be involuntary, with no insight. My first psychotic break, fake, involved hallucinations attending to me, boys delivering my consequences for overloving, which was raping me. Being a bad date shouldn't be a trigger. It doesn't count. Rob, get inside. Don't start faking for attention. There will be consequences. Bad me. Shit. There is no trigger in sight. What time is it? Okay. Eli plays along. Phone call. Hey, where are you? Hey, breathe. It's okay. I'm not upset. No, I'm not trying to make you come home. I just felt like hanging out with my boyfriend. Where are you? I could come and. Oh, wow, really? That sounds really unfair of him to make you do that. And so that's the reason you left? To find him? No, I'm not mad at him. No, I wouldn't let him hurt me. It's okay for you to tell me. Here, why don't I help you come find him and I can bring a flashlight? Yes, I'd love to sing with you. That's very smart since you know it'll keep you safe. I'll even bring the cards and some Sprite Zero, and after we find him, we can all have a picnic together. I bet he'll like that. Yes, we can take the train home instead of a car. I know you love a night train. No, I'd never be mad. I love you when you're like this. After nights like these, you twitch in your sleep, which means I get lots of extra squeezes. It's my favorite. Where are you, Angel? Take your time. Take your time, Angel. Oh, great. This will be so fun. I've never been to that park at this time of night. I bet the floodlights are beautiful. Are they beautiful? Tell me what floodlights you can see, beautiful. Cart transcription. Haywire, aren't you? Debrief, it's okay. Hamada, sad no. Hamat dry into my achy. Oh, come home. I just fell, the light hanging, out with my poise. Friend, where art? You, I, good command. A while reeling, that sound, real lean fare, a vim, tum ache, you zoo that. Dance soda, diz the reeds in. You lift to find him. No whim not made. At hymnal, I wouldn't to let him herd meet. Soak A for you too. Till me, here wide on tide. Help you come find. Dim and die can preen, guff laugh, slight yeah. Side love, true singing with youth at fairies. Mart sins, you know what, well keep you safe. I'll even burying thick hearts. Handsome sprite is hero, and off tear. Wi-Fi and dim, weekend all have. A pick, neck to gather. I bet hell like that. Yes, we can ache. The train omen steady fucker. I know you'll. Often height rain. No widen. Ever be. Mad I love you. When you're like this. Have turn heights slight these. You to wish in our sleep. Wish means sigh get. Lots of fix, trust queasies. Sits my fake fear. It where? Are you? Wayne jeweled. Ache your time. Day cure time. Angel. O grey to thistle bees, O fun ivy. Never be in tooth at perk at this time. Of night I bed. The flood. Lie to sore be you. To full. Are they be you? Too full till me what flood. Lights you can see. You too full. The friending of burden. Suffering as in something to care about. Suffering as in still alive. The way we must elaborate suffered and died to indicate the ending of burden. There is this shame in pursuing happiness and abandoning sadness with no one to care for it. I understand this sounds like the defending of burden. When you are drowning, a short breath is better than none. But when you are crazy, any flash of clarity forces a contending with burden. I grab the boy by the shoulders, shake him, scream at him to pull himself together, throw a drink in his face. It's me, bartending my burden. I'm Rob? I've been Rob this whole time? Thank God for psychosis, so I don't have to believe any of this actually happened, the sublime suspending of burden. I am the painting on the wall, my body the security guard standing in front, but he is on his phone, having long lost interest in attending to burden. I begin to miss the thrill of volatility, obsession, incessance. When health comes to me, dull and bored, I find myself recommending him burden. Why this fear still? There is always a theater in the hospital where we dance. There is always a makeshift school where we learn by comprehending our burden. I have fallen in love with what I cannot do. To have a limit, how delightfully human. A relief to lack the responsibility of a God to solve that which impendingly burdens. Me and Rosie complaining, exchanging office stories. This is where I catch us laughing. All those nights scrubbing Toms into her teeth, joyful in the codepending of burden. I think this is my last one. Yes. Eli interprets. At the Kim Petras concert, I watched the sign language interpreter during throat goat. These lips go la la la, give me that, yeah, 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 yeah. Curved hands rotating above each other in opposite directions, just below the mouth. Cheeks sucked in, then puffed out. How silly to understand anything. On my way home, I feel the familiar click of my tongue falling down my throat. I walk into the apartment, hitting my head with a teaspoon. When we get on FaceTime, Eli is chopping scallions, glancing over at the phone. He asks how I am. I attempt. It's always dark and start and go, and there's no Tom that is awake. It's always dark and sleep and goodbye and please. He nods. Yes, dark, you. Personally, I'd be happy if you stay alive. I walk circles around my studio like a procrastinating ghost. Eli asks if I've had anything to eat. I try again. If there were no laws not, I think, absent circles, illegal circles, if I existed worse than Tom illegal circles, and want if my nonsense interrupts itself, it does not correspond. Still, Eli nods. Ah, you want sushi? You're a little schizo and want to break your veganism to get a salmon roll. The bodega worker is used to this by now. As I check out, he waves hello to the tiny Eli in my phone. In the morning, my voice apologizes to Eli while I lag behind. I'm so lucky, he replies. I got to hear 4 brilliant ways you'd start every sentence. Anyway, I saw a new bird yesterday. I heard this strange call in the park. While I listen, I decide I cannot die. Not yet. He has so many more songs to figure out. Okay, that's the end of my piece. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm so looking forward to hearing Sarah talk. Thanks, everyone.
Wow, I have no words, Rob. You have all the words, and it was really a privilege to get to hear what you have to share in your beautiful poetry. And now we're gonna move on to Sarah.
Yeah, thank you, Miriam, and thank you, Rob, for sharing your work. Yeah, beautiful. So I'll segue. I'm Sarah Redikopp. I'm a doctoral candidate who's been writing about self-harm for some time. And so the reflections I share today are sort of emergent. And they take up findings from my research, which drew on narrative interviews with 14 women, trans, and non-binary adults living in Canada who identify with self-harm. And my research works to destabilize dominant understandings of self-harm as a pathological problem behavior. And I think Rob and I's work dialogues in this way. So by taking lived experience accounts of self-harm seriously as sites of mad and feminist theorizing, My doctoral research works to cultivate reparative engagements with lived experience of self-harm as a multiplicitous and complex body-mind practice, which is embedded within and which responds to the intersecting social, political, and structural contexts of everyday life. That is, I work to expand self-harm beyond thinking about it as a kind of practice someone does, like cutting or burning, and instead to kind of approach it as an emergent practice involved in turning towards the self in order to attend to what hurts. This more capacious understanding, not necessarily of what self-harm is, but what self-harm does in its lived contexts, opens space to resist the pathologization of self-harm. So in what I share today, I take up the dominant framing of self-harm as problem, which I align with curative imaginaries in disability and madness. I forward an alternative reading of self-harm, what I'm kind of describing as a reparative reading. And then later in the presentation, or in a few minutes, I'll flesh out the effects of curative imaginaries in self-harm with reference to a participant narrative, which was shared with me throughout the course of my research, and close with some reflections on the possibilities of engaging with self-harm, which move beyond the curative. So by approaching self-harm reparatively, that is by engaging with self-harm in a manner which Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick describes as, quote, additive and accretive, which wants to assemble and confer plenitude on an object. My research intervenes into the affective registers of shock or horror or concern or confusion, which characterize much scholarly work on self-harm. Across clinical, sociological, and popular literatures which take up the question of self-harm, it is almost always framed as a maladaptive, secretive, and shameful problem. For example, Marilee Strong's widely cited book, Bright Red Scream, which was published in 1998, proceeds with the intention to present the, quote, tortured stories of cutters who Strong describes as the walking wounded. Strong's subjects are positioned as submerged in pain, so desperate to escape that cutting is all they can do. And more recently, in his 2015 book titled Making Sense of Self-Harm, sociologist Peter Stegels characterizes self-harm as a practice, quote, wrapped in an enigmatic, dark, and troubling aura, a kind of haunting otherness that intrigues and disturbs us at the same time. In the clinical literature, self-harm is almost always positioned as a maladaptive behavior. A leading psychiatrist who takes up, I guess, what would be called non-suicidal self-injury in the DSM, Matthew Knock writes that, quote, self-injurious behaviors are one of the most concerning and perplexing of all human behaviors. Particularly puzzling are instances in which people hurt themselves with no intention of dying. If not to die, why would people do such a thing? References to reduced capacities for emotion regulation, a lack of problem solving and distress tolerance skills, or poor communication strategies color clinical framings of people who self-harm as difficult, emotional, and impulsive, as failing to adaptively manage their distress. Moreover, the self-harming subject in medical encounters is understood as violating trust between doctor and patient. One clinician writes for The Lancet, when patients deliberately inflict harm on themselves by, for example, taking overdoses or cutting themselves, the contract between doctor and patient is severely tested. To hurt oneself is to violate the contract between doctor and patient, a contract which is oriented towards cure, towards restoring and maintaining the closed, contained, and individual body. The intentional infliction of harm or damage to oneself is understood to undo the work of the physician, to position the self-harming subject as maladaptive, as failed, as both troubled and troubling. This normative rendering of self-harm as problem rather than as possibility constitutes one intervention of my research. Rather than beginning from an understanding of self-harm as a practice steeped in haunting otherness, my work begins from a place of familiarity with self-harm. As a mad researcher and as someone with lived experience of self-harm, I reject the view of self-harm as strange. Instead, I follow psychiatric survivor and mad researcher Claire Shaw, who writes that many of the ways that we cope with a bad day or respond to bad feelings are actively or potentially harmful to ourselves. Cigarettes, alcohol, hours of mindless television, overwork, overexercise. Viewing self-harm in context of a range of socially sanctioned behaviors, Shaw writes that, quote, "We all know what it's like to cause harm to ourselves. Self-injury is not some strange, marginal, pathological behavior. In many ways, it is at the heart of how we live. It's what we expect of each other." I thus begin and enter into a reading of self-harm from a place of deep listening, of partial truths, of situatedness. This reading eschews binaries between healthy and pathological kinds of embodied relationships with the self, opening different ways of understanding harm, cure, and care. In several ways, my project builds on histories of feminist, psychiatric survivor, and mad resistance to the pathologization of self-harm, and which trouble normative conceptualizations of harm and the effectiveness of psychiatric responses as care or cure. These accounts trouble understandings of self-harm as always bad, as pathological, as in need of intervention and rehabilitation, while simultaneously recognizing and holding space for the pain and distress which can accompany self-harm. That is, self-harm both hurts and heals and does significant work for those using it and significant work for the people I spoke with in my research. In the words of anti-psychiatrist Bonnie Burstow, self-harm is fundamentally a way of living. It is a means of getting through the day. And as one participant in my research, Emily, reflected, there's actually something quite hopeful about it. By leaning into the reparative, I simultaneously work against the curative. That is an approach to self-harm which constitutes it as a problem to be identified, treated, and rehabilitated, and most importantly, eradicated. Critical disability scholars have underscored the embeddedness of cure in normalizing processes embedded within structures of power and violence. Alison Kafer in Feminist Queer Crip uses the concept of a curative imaginary to refer to an understanding of disability that not only expects and assumes intervention, but also cannot imagine or comprehend anything other than intervention. Curative approaches to disability and other non-normative and pathologized body-mind practices, such as self-harm, are oriented towards identifying, preventing, and eliminating body-mind difference and body-mind trouble. These practices in elimination and correction, while purporting to help, exist in relation to violence and rely on a normative assumption that body-mind difference, sickness, and disability and madness are bad, unwanted, and undesirable. I suggest that these logics and practices of cure extend to self-harm. In a normative approach, self-harm is never seen as a good thing. In clinical settings, prevention of self-harm is the primary goal of treatment for self-harming patients. And prevention happens through intervention, which can look like no harm contracts between clients and therapists, psychiatric hospitalization and the attendant supervision, restriction of movement, removal of personal belongings, seclusion, unwanted drugging. And beyond clinical settings, as participants shared with me in my research, the removal of bedroom doors or being forced to sleep in their parents' beds. These curative interventions produce harm and justify harm, all while purporting to end harm, to end self-harm. Psychiatric survivor Ruta Mazelis writes that when discomfort and reactivity to self-injury become paramount, the person living with self-injury becomes an object to be controlled rather than understood. Throughout my work, while I was hearing about various and lived meanings of self-harm, I was simultaneously hearing stories about responses to self-harm, which struck me. In many participant narratives, it was the response to self-harm, often from parents or teachers or therapists or medical professionals, rather than the self-harm itself, which participants experienced as inflicting greater damage. In light of these stories, I began to think about the way that responses to self-harm shore up understandings of self-harm as a problem requiring intervention. What do understandings of self-harm as problem reveal about how we understand and engage with emotional distress? How are these responses shaped in relation to age, gender, race, class, ability, and place? What does cure make possible in relation to self-harm? What violences are excused, even recommended, in response to the supposed problem of self-harm? I'm interested in the ways that ideologies of cure work to both position self-harm as a problem and to justify harmful responses to self-harm in the name of cure. So my interview with Lee offers one point of entry into thinking through the ways in which curative imaginaries are at work in how self-harm is responded to. And ways responded to in ways which undermine agency and dignity and connection. So in what follows, I work to present Lee's account of self-harm being figured as a problem to be eradicated rather than to be engaged with. And I share excerpts from our interview. Lee is a pseudonym. This has been anonymized, but some things I, can't translate really. You just have to hear them. So Lee is a queer white woman in her early 20s at the time of our interview. She grew up in a middle-class family in Southern Ontario, and she started cutting herself when she was 10. And she locates her self-harm in context of intense and overwhelming emotions. In our interview, Lee shares, I felt like my emotions would get so big inside of me, like they were this ball of like electric energy. And like it was so big that there was no other way for me to let it out or even begin to deal with it because it was just too big, like all consuming, didn't feel like enough, like it's bigger than that. In Lee's experience, hurting herself offered one practice through which she could find grounding and connection and relief from things which were all too big. It was a resource. Lee tells me that she was cutting herself every day after school and that it was her only comfort as she struggled with overwhelming emotions and dissociation. When Lee was about 12, a friend from school became aware of her self-harm, and she pushed Lee to tell an adult. Lee shares, quote, she like talked to me first and she was like, this is bad. Like, you need to tell someone. I'm going to tell someone. Like, you can come do it with me. I'll come with you. And like, we can go to like a teacher or a doctor or like whatever you want, but like, we have to tell someone. Lee was presented with two choices: tell an adult, a teacher or a doctor, or have an adult be told for her. Lee agreed to go with her friend to speak with her 7th grade homeroom teacher. And Lee recalls, I was just crying and my friend explained the situation. And then my teacher asked to see my cuts. And I showed her. And then I got taken down to the office. After being taken down to the principal's office, Lee waited there while the school principal called her parents to come in for a meeting. Lee says, we had a meeting in the school boardroom with my teacher and the principal and both of my parents and me. And like to this day, I do not know what the point of that really was. Like, I think it was just my teacher telling my parents what happened, but it felt like a very big thing. Like, I remember that more than I remember like other parts of also I like fully dissociated for parts of it. So there's that. But I like remember sitting at the head of the board table, just crying. And like my teacher and the principal were on one side and my parents were on the other side. And they were just like, what do we do? And I was just there for all of it. Like, can I go home? I don't want to be here. In our transcript, Lee uses the word traumatic to describe this meeting. Her description of the meeting as a very big thing from which she dissociated, and her vivid description of sitting at the head of a boardroom table surrounded by adults of authority in her life, parents and teachers, meeting in order to respond to the very big thing, the very big problem of her self-harm, is chilling. It struck me and still strikes me that Lee's efforts to attend to herself were responded to so swiftly, so intensely, and without a meaningful conversation with Lee herself. Following this meeting, Lee shares that she was taken home and put on pretty much house arrest. The next day, her parents took her to see her family doctor, who recommended that Lee's parents, quote, take time off work and stay at home with me to watch me 24/7. Lee says, I wasn't allowed to be in a room alone, and I wasn't allowed to like go to school. And like in hindsight, I see how that would have been a really scary time for my parents, but that was also like the worst time. I was like, this makes things exponentially worse, like you don't even know. In the weeks that followed, Lee was taken to a lot of doctors. I get the sense that Lee positions herself in this part of her narrative as being acted upon, as being folded into a maze-like system where the problem was her self-harm rather than her overwhelming affective distress and life conditions, which the self-harm helped her attend to. Lee says, I got taken to some place and like it was some weird building that I don't remember. Like I vaguely remember driving there and being in the building and being asked a bunch of questions by this woman. But I remember also my dad being there the whole time, which just meant that I couldn't be honest at all because obviously if I could talk to my parents about these things, I would have. A lot of just like quiet car rides and weird chains of like, talk to this person. Okay, talk to this person. Okay, now go see this person. Never the same person, always just someone weird and new at a desk. Lee describes this experience of being folded into the formal mental health care system as primarily bureaucratic and highly alienating, one in which she lacked choice and at the same time knew that there was a right and a wrong way to answer the questions she was being asked. Lee says, I wasn't given the choice, but I could tell that the way the questions they were asking me were phrased is like there was a right and a wrong answer of like how to go to the hospital and how to like just go home, which is all I wanted at that point. And so, yeah, I wasn't super honest. It always felt like more of a bureaucratic process of like, okay, like, oh my God, she's hurting herself. Like, is she going to go home and kill herself? Or is this just another week for her? Which box? Okay, you'll be fine. Whatever. Go home, do therapy. Have you tried scribbling? Okay, have a good day. Or like, okay, you're going to go to the hospital. And like, yeah, it just never felt like they were actually like, this is a pretty intense reaction to like the things going on in your life. Do you want to dive into that kind of thing? And yeah, even in therapy, I felt like I couldn't talk openly about it because I knew that I would just get sent to the hospital or that my parents would be told, which for me meant like house arrest with my parents. Lee is clear about the impossibilities of speaking her self-harm in ways that invite nurturing or even curious engagement. Instead, Lee was tasked with navigating risk evaluations and professional responses which ranged from ineffective and dismissive to punitive. What is missing for Lee is a channel of engagement with her self-harm and the intense and overwhelming affects and conditions informing her self-harm, which is supportive and curious. She shares, it felt like nobody yeah, I felt like I was something that was being passed around to see like, oh, what do we do? What do we do? Because nobody knew what to do, which to me has always just been like, why the fuck didn't anyone just like sit me down and talk to me for like an hour and a half, like really honestly as a person? That would have probably been far more helpful than the weird like chain of events that I have literally blocked out of my mind. Like I don't remember doing that. Lee shares that her self-harm was treated like a secret that she and others could not talk about. Although great efforts were made by adults in her life to curb her behavior, Lee was never given alternatives which were effective or meaningful to her. Instead, her self-harm was responded to with disallowance. As Lee says, they were just like, that's bad, don't do that. Lee's various experiences with mental health care resources, including CBT therapy, distress lines, and various counselors, ultimately denied her space to speak openly and honestly about her experiences with self-harm without fearing retribution. Lee shares, a lot of my experience with resources as someone who self-harms has just been like, keep it hush hush, try and find a way around talking about like the actual action. I've always said I have a history of it, that I have urges, but it's always been like, don't actually talk about doing it kind of thing. And something I feel that I can't be honest with mental health professionals about wanting to do and struggling with because they don't see it as part of a bigger thing. It just is like something that can be dealt with and has an answer, go to the hospital, which always seemed, again, like more of a punishment. These responses to Lee's self-harm provide one sight through which to think about the ways in which self-harm is framed curatively and responded to punitively, in ways which disallow and seek to eradicate rather than engage. Speaking on her experience as a white adolescent girl, Lee's narrative also raises questions about how responses to self-harm as a problem that something can be done about, in Lee's case, going to the hospital, keeping her on house arrest, bringing her to the doctor, exist in relation to particularly aged, gendered, and racialized embodiment, where concern over self-harm as a problem impacting girls like Lee makes sense. Makes these institutionalized and curative responses possible and reasonable. So in concluding, I pose perhaps more questions than answers. What other possibilities exist for responding to self-harm? What kinds of responses to and engagements with self-harm are experienced as supportive by people hurting themselves? What can mapping curative imaginaries in self-harm as these circulate relationally, affectively, and institutionally do in crafting and imagining mad and feminist engagements with self-harm, not as problem, but as possibility? Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Sarah. I just love the insight and care, especially the care that you brought to Lee's story, and I'm sure experiences, and I'm sure all the other interview participants that you worked with for your thesis. So thank you.